A woman is walking home from work. Same street she's walked 1,000 times. Same tired steps, same hollow ache she's carried for 9 years. And then a stranger passes her on the sidewalk, a woman on a phone call, not slowing down, not looking at her, and says a single word. A name. A name that had never existed in any book, any classroom, any birth record. A name a little girl had invented at age 3 for a friend no one else could see. Clare Monroe froze in the middle of a crowded sidewalk. People split around her like water around a stone. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, because the woman had just said Leia. And then, still walking, still not looking at Karen, still speaking in the flat, even tone of someone finishing a phone call, the woman said something else. You will find her, but you won't remember me. She turned a corner. She was gone. Karen stood there, shaking, trying to figure out if she'd just lost her mind. 9 years of grief can do that to a person. 9 years of missing flyers and cold leads and false hopes can erode the line between what's real and what you're desperate to believe. But she had heard it. Leia. The name only she and Claire had ever known. And somewhere in her chest, something she had almost stopped believing cracked back open. This is the story of a child stolen in 90 seconds. A witness who saw everything and said nothing for almost a decade. And a single word on a crowded street that finally, after 9 years of silence, broke the case wide open. It is April 1998. Milbrook, New York. Clare Monroe is 3 years old. She is outside in the front yard on a warm spring afternoon, sitting on a blanket, arranging dolls for a tea party, talking to someone her mother can't see. Karen watches her through the kitchen window, smiling. Claire has always been like this, full of light, full of stories, full of a world that exists just slightly beyond what everyone else can see. Her imaginary friend Leia lives in the garden, comes to play when no one else is around. Claire talks to her like she's real, because to Claire, she is. Karen is doing laundry. She checks on Claire every few minutes through that window. 3:40, still there. 3:44, still there. At 3:47, Karen goes down to the basement to switch the load. She'll be gone 2, maybe 3 minutes. She's done this 100 times. The basement is directly below the kitchen. She'll be right back. She switches the laundry. She heads back up. She looks out the window. The blanket is still there. The dolls are still arranged in their circle. Claire is gone. The next few minutes are the kind that permanently alter a person. Karen running outside, calling Claire's name. Running to the backyard, to the neighbor's yard, back to the front. The street is quiet. Nothing is moving. No answer. No sound. Just the terrible, widening silence where a 3-year-old should be. She calls 911. Her hands are shaking so badly she almost misdials. Police arrive in 10 minutes. Dogs track Claire's scent straight to the curb, then lose it. She got into a vehicle. Whoever took her came with a plan. Detective Paul Harrison arrives and takes over the scene. He knocks on every door. He asks every neighbor the same questions. Did you see a car? A person? Anything unusual around 3:45? Most of them say no. One of them is lying. Diane Foster lives directly across the street. She is 42 years old, and she has not left her property in over a year. Severe agoraphobia, the kind that doesn't just make you nervous outside, it makes the world feel like it will kill you if you step into it. Her entire life exists within the 4 walls of that house and the window she sits beside every single day, watching the neighborhood move without her. On April 15th, 1998, at 3:47 in the afternoon, Diane is in her usual spot when a van pulls up in front of the Monroe house. Light-colored, unmarked, except for what looks like an organizational logo on the side. 2 men get out. Diane watches them the way she watches everything, with the quiet, fixed attention of someone who has nothing else to do but observe. And something about these 2 makes the back of her neck prickle. One of the men is wearing a vest. The kind with a logo stitched on the chest. The kind that says official. The kind that makes people lower their guard without even realizing it. He walks to the front yard. He crouches down next to the little girl on the blanket. He says something. Diane can't hear what. The girl looks up at him, listens, and then nods. Diane's stomach drops. The man says something else. The girl stands up. She starts walking toward the van. Diane is on her feet before she realizes she's moved. Her hands are shaking. Everything in her is screaming that this is wrong, that she needs to call someone, run outside, yell. But her body won't cooperate. The thought of opening that front door, of stepping outside, is enough to close her throat. The second man slides open the van's side door. The first man picks Claire up, places her inside, closes the door, and then he looks up, directly at Diane's window. She steps back, but it's too late. He's already seen her. His face doesn't change, no anger, no panic. Just a calm, deliberate stillness that is somehow more terrifying than rage. He raises one hand, brings his finger slowly to his lips. Then he points at her mailbox, at the numbers on the front of her house. "I know where you live." The van pulls away, turns the corner, disappears. The whole thing has taken less than 90 seconds. Diane sits back down in her chair. She is trembling from her core outward. She has just watched a child be taken. She is the only witness. And the man who did it just made sure she knows that speaking will cost her something she can't afford to pay. 2 hours later, Detective Harrison knocks on her door. Diane almost doesn't answer. But not answering would be suspicious. The police are talking to everyone. So she opens the door, chain lock still on, speaks through the gap. She tells him she was in the back of the house, wasn't near the window, didn't see anything. She's sorry she can't help. She hopes they find the little girl. Harrison thanks her and moves on. Diane closes the door, walks back to her window, and watches Clare Monroe stand in her front yard looking like a person who has just had the center ripped out of them. Watches the police cars, the search teams, the frantic movement of people trying to find a child who is already miles away. And Diane cries. Because she knows exactly what she just did. She handed that little girl over to silence. And there is no version of herself she can tell a story to that makes that okay. 9 years is a long time to live with something like that. 9 years of watching Clare Monroe from across the street. Watching her tape up missing person flyers when the old ones faded. Watching her leave for work every morning at the same time. Walk the same route. Come home to the same empty house. Watching hope slowly drain out of a person until what's left isn't hope anymore. It's just endurance. Just the mechanical act of continuing to exist. Diane watched all of it. Her agoraphobia got worse after Claire disappeared. She stopped going outside entirely. Had groceries delivered. Cut off most human contact. Built a life so small it barely qualified as one. And every single day, that window was both her punishment and her prison. Because it kept Claire's absence right in front of her face where she couldn't pretend it away. She told herself the man would come back if she talked. Told herself she had no choice. Told herself Claire was probably already gone, probably already past saving, that speaking up would only put her own life at risk for nothing. She was good at telling herself things. Then one evening in March 2007, Diane is watching the 6 o'clock news when the anchor cuts to a breaking story. Federal agents have just dismantled a major illegal adoption ring operating across New York State for over 15 years. 12 arrests. Dozens of children taken from their families, sold to desperate couples who paid anywhere between $20,000 and $60,000 per child. The ring used fake charity credentials, posed as social workers, targeted children in unguarded moments when parents weren't watching. Diane turns up the volume. Then the screen cuts to footage of the arrests. And in the background of one shot, a man being led out of a building in handcuffs, wearing a vest with an organizational logo on it. The same vest. The same logo. Diane stands up from her chair and walks straight to the television screen like she needs to be closer to be sure. But she is sure. She was sure the moment she saw it. That is the organization. Those are the men. The same people who pulled up in front of the Monroe house on a Tuesday afternoon and took a 3-year-old girl while her mother was in the basement switching laundry. And the reporter is saying something that stops Diane cold. The children weren't killed. They were sold. Placed with families who believed, or chose to believe, they were adopting legally. Which meant Clare Monroe might not be dead. Might be 12 years old right now. Might be sitting in a classroom somewhere under a name that isn't hers, living a life that was built on a lie, with no idea that her real mother has spent 9 years looking for her. Diane turns off the television and sits in the dark for a long time. For 9 years she had insulated herself inside the story that it was already too late. That the damage was done. That her silence hadn't mattered in the end because there was nothing left to save. And that story had just been taken away from her. The guilt that had always been present but manageable suddenly becomes something else entirely. Something with weight and teeth. Claire is alive. Diane has information that could bring her home. And she has been sitting on it for 9 years because she was afraid. She spends 3 weeks deciding what to do. 3 weeks of picking up the phone and putting it back down. 3 weeks of standing at her front door with her hand on the knob and then walking away. 3 weeks of watching Clare Monroe through the window, still walking the same route, still coming home to that empty house, and trying to figure out how to be brave enough to change that. She can't go to the police directly, can't handle the exposure, the questions, the attention, having her name attached to any of this. But she can reach Karen, can give her just enough to reopen the case, can point her toward the truth without stepping fully into the light. Diane starts making a plan. She chooses Main Street, Karen's route home from work. The same path she's watched her walk for 9 years from behind a window. Diane studies the timing, figures out exactly when Karen passes through downtown, practices what she's going to say, just 2 things, because 2 things is all it will take. 1 to prove this isn't random, 1 to point toward hope. On April 10th, 2007, Diane Foster leaves her house for the first time in 8 months. She walks to Main Street, positions herself so their paths will cross, pulls out her phone and holds it to her ear. Her heart is going so fast she can feel it in her throat. Every instinct she has is telling her to turn around, go home, stay invisible. But she keeps walking. She sees Karen approaching in the crowd. She times her steps. And as they pass each other on that sidewalk, Diane says the word. Quietly, clearly, the way you'd say anything in the middle of a phone call. Leia. Karen stops dead. Diane keeps walking, doesn't slow down, doesn't look at her, says the second thing in the same flat tone, like she's just wrapping up a conversation. You will find her, but you won't remember me. She turns the corner, picks up her pace, doesn't stop until she's 3 blocks away, standing in a side street with her hands shaking and her lungs burning and something in her chest that feels, for the first time in 9 years, like she's moving in the right direction. But she's not done. A word on the street isn't enough. Karen needs real information, details, something concrete that a detective can use. And Diane has those details locked in her memory with the kind of terrible clarity that only comes from watching something you can't unsee. She spends 2 days writing and rewriting a note, trying to include enough to be useful without including anything that reveals who she is or where she lives. She writes about the van, light-colored, unmarked, a logo on the side. She describes the 2 men, the vest, the logo that had made the man look like someone you could trust, the direction the van had gone when it left Maple Street. She writes an apology, doesn't sign it. At 3 in the morning on April 13th, Diane crosses the street for the first time since 1998, walks up to Clare Monroe's front door, places an envelope on the doorstep, walks back home, locks her door, goes to her window, and waits. At 7 the next morning, Karen opens her front door to leave for work, sees the envelope, opens it right there on the step. Diane watches her read it, watches the exact moment the words land, watches Karen's face shift into something she hasn't seen from across that street in years. Karen runs back inside, comes back out with her keys, gets in her car and drives away fast. Diane knows exactly where she's going. Detective Paul Harrison has not thought about the Clare Monroe case in over a year. It lives in a filing cabinet with the other cold cases, the ones with no leads, no evidence, no forward momentum. The cases that investigators learn to quietly mourn and move past. Then Clare Monroe walks into his office holding an envelope. She looks older than he remembers. Harder. But there's something alive in her face that wasn't there the last time he saw her. She hands him the envelope and tells him about the woman on Main Street, the name Leia, the words you will find her, and Harrison listens without interrupting. He opens the note, reads it once, reads it again. This is not a crank. This is not someone seeking attention. This is someone who was there. Someone who saw exactly what happened and has been carrying it ever since. The detail about the vest, the logo, the direction the van traveled. This is a witness. Harrison looks up at Karen. Then he picks up the phone and reopens the Clare Monroe case. Harrison moves fast. He pulls the original case files, spreads everything across his desk, and starts rebuilding the investigation from scratch, but this time with one critical piece of new information. The vest. The logo. An organization that made strangers look trustworthy enough for a 3-year-old to take their hand and walk toward a van. He cross-references the description against the federal arrest records from the adoption ring bust. It matches. The organization, the method, the timing, all of it lines up. Clare Monroe wasn't a random target. She was selected, identified in advance, taken to order. Harrison contacts the FBI and requests access to the ring's full operational records. Hundreds of transactions. 15 years of stolen children, fake documents, desperate families who paid cash and asked no questions. The files arrive in boxes. Harrison starts going through them the way you go through something when you know the answer is in there somewhere. Methodically, obsessively, refusing to stop. He's looking for a specific transaction. Female. 3 years old in April 1998. Taken from Millbrook, New York. Blonde hair, blue eyes. He finds 17 possible matches. 17 girls placed in New York State between April and June of that year. All approximately the right age. All with paperwork that, on the surface, looks legitimate. Harrison starts eliminating them one by one. He checks birth records against hospital records. Checks enrollment dates against placement dates. Looks for the telltale signs of documents assembled rather than generated, rounded dates. Physicians who retired before the births they supposedly attended, hospitals with no record of the deliveries listed. 3 files stand out. Albany, Rochester, Syracuse. Harrison requests recent photographs from the schools each girl attends. Yearbook photos. Anything current. The photos arrive over 3 days, and Harrison lines them up next to the age progression images the FBI created for Clare Monroe years ago, a digital rendering of what a missing 3-year-old might look like at 12. Albany, wrong facial structure, wrong build. Not her. Rochester, closer. Similar coloring. But the eyes are off. The jaw doesn't match. Syracuse. Harrison looks at the photo from Jefferson Middle School in Syracuse and feels something shift in his chest. Same eyes. Same nose. Same slight dimple on the left cheek that Karen Monroe had described in the original report back in 1998. He pulls up the age progression image and holds it next to the school photo. The resemblance is not a coincidence. Nothing about this is a coincidence. The file reads, Lucy Walker, age 12. Enrolled at Jefferson Middle School. Living with Robert and Susan Walker at a residential address in Syracuse. Placed in April 1998. Birth certificate shows she was born March 12, 1995, in Syracuse General Hospital. Harrison calls Syracuse General. There is no record of that birth. He looks up the attending physician listed on the certificate. That doctor retired in 1992, 6 years before Lucy Walker was supposedly born. The documents are fake. Well-constructed, professionally assembled, but fake. Harrison pulls the transaction record. Robert and Susan Walker paid $35,000 on April 10, 1998. 5 days before Clare Monroe disappeared from her front yard. The money had been paid in advance. The ring had already identified the Walkers as buyers before they ever found Clare. She wasn't taken and then sold. She was sold and then taken. Harrison sits back in his chair and stares at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picks up the phone and calls the Syracuse Police Department. He needs surveillance. Discreet. He needs photographs of Lucy Walker, walking to school, in public, going about her day. He needs to be sure before he moves. He can't walk into a 12-year-old girl's life and detonate it based on paperwork alone. He needs Karen Monroe to look at this child and feel something. And then he needs science to confirm what he already knows. The surveillance runs for 3 days. The photos come back showing a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes walking to school with a backpack over one shoulder, sitting in a classroom by the window, laughing at lunch with 2 friends, living a completely ordinary life. Having absolutely no idea that 300 miles away, a detective is staring at her face and seeing someone else entirely. Harrison drives to Karen Monroe's apartment, knocks on her door, sits down at her kitchen table and slides the photographs across to her. Karen picks them up, studies them, and the room goes very quiet. Karen stares at the photographs for a long time without speaking. Harrison watches her face, watches her eyes move across the image, the girl's profile, her posture, the way she's turned slightly towards someone off camera. He watches Karen's expression do something complicated and painful that he doesn't have words for. Then Karen starts crying. And she says she can't be sure. She says 9 years is too long. Says Claire was 3 years old and this girl is 12 and she wants it to be her. God, she wants it to be her. but she can't look at a surveillance photograph and tell him with certainty that this is her daughter. She's terrified of being wrong. Terrified of believing and then having it taken away again. Harrison tells her that's okay. That's exactly why they're going to do a DNA test. He just needed her to look. He files for a court order that afternoon. Submits the fake documents, the timeline, the transaction records, the physical resemblance, everything he's built over the past 2 weeks. The judge grants it with one condition: the test has to be conducted carefully. Therapists present. Minimal trauma to the child. Harrison spends a week coordinating. Child Protective Services. FBI liaison. A therapist who specializes in exactly this kind of case. Children raised under false identities. Children whose entire understanding of themselves is about to be rewritten. You don't just walk up to a 12-year-old girl and tell her she's someone else. You have to do this right. On May 2nd, 2007, Harrison arrives at Jefferson Middle School during lunch period and asks to speak with Lucy Walker privately. She comes into the counselor's office looking scared, asking if she's in trouble, asking if something happened to her parents. She's 12 years old and small for her age, and she holds herself very still the way kids do when they're trying not to show that they're frightened. Harrison tells her she's not in trouble. Tells her they just need to talk. He asks her what she remembers from when she was very young. Before school. She says normal things. Living at home, trips to the park, her mom's cooking. He asks about before that. Before she can remember clearly. Before the earliest memories she can actually hold on to. Lucy hesitates. She says sometimes she has dreams. Or maybe memories. She's never been sure which. A different yard. A different house. A voice she doesn't recognize singing something she can't quite hear. And a name. Leia. Harrison keeps his face completely neutral. But inside, everything just locked into place. He asks who Leia is. Lucy says she doesn't know. Says her mom always told her it was just an imaginary friend, that lots of kids have them, that it didn't mean anything. She learned not to bring it up because it seemed to make Susan uncomfortable. The therapist leans forward gently and explains to Lucy that sometimes children are placed with families through adoptions that weren't done legally. That sometimes children were taken from their birth families without anyone's consent. That sometimes a child grows up not knowing their real name. Lucy's eyes go wide. She asks very quietly if that's what happened to her. The therapist says they're not certain yet. That's why they need her help. Harrison explains the DNA test. Tells her they want to compare her DNA to a woman who may be her birth mother. Tells her the woman's name is Clare Monroe. That Karen had a daughter named Claire who disappeared 9 years ago. That Claire would be 12 years old now. Lucy asks if he thinks she's Claire. Harrison looks at her steadily and says the DNA test will tell them the truth. They swab her cheek. Send the sample to the lab. Results in 3 to 5 days. Harrison calls Robert and Susan Walker that evening and tells them what's happening. Susan starts crying immediately. Robert says they didn't know. Says they were told it was a private adoption, that everything was legitimate, that the documents were real. Says they never would have. Harrison cuts him off. Not tonight. Tonight is about Lucy. Everything else comes later. 3 days pass. The results come back on a Thursday morning. Harrison is alone in his office when he opens the envelope. He reads the number at the top of the report. 99.9%. He sits with it for a moment. 9 years. A mother who never stopped. A witness who finally spoke. Fake documents and a vest with a logo and a van that turned a corner and disappeared. All of it, every single thread, led here. To this number. To this piece of paper in his hands. He picks up the phone and calls Clare Monroe. He tells her to come to the station. Tells her he has news about Claire. She arrives in 20 minutes. Walks through the door already reading his face. Sits down before he has to ask her to. He slides the DNA report across the desk and watches her eyes find the number at the top. The sound she makes is not quite crying and not quite anything else. It is the sound of 9 years of not knowing finally ending. Harrison gives her as long as she needs. Then he asks if she's ready to see her daughter. Karen says yes before he finishes the sentence. But Harrison slows her down. Sits forward. Explains what she's walking into, because Karen needs to understand this before she walks through that door. Claire does not remember her. Not her face. Not her voice. Not Maple Street or the tea party blanket or the yellow dress or any of the 1,000 small details Karen has kept alive in her mind for 9 years. The memories of a 3-year-old don't survive intact across a decade of being told they were dreams. Lucy Walker has never known a mother named Karen, has never known a house in Millbrook, has never known she was anyone other than who the Walkers told her she was. She is not a missing child waiting to be rescued. She is a 12-year-old girl whose entire world is about to be turned upside down. And the way Karen enters that world in the next few days will shape everything that comes after. Karen listens, nods, says she understands. Harrison watches her face and believes her. There is something in Clare Monroe that 9 years of searching has refined down to something very steady. She is not going to run into that room and grab her daughter and collapse. She has waited this long. She knows how to hold herself together when it matters. The meeting is arranged for 2 days later. The delay is for Lucy. Therapists spend those 2 days with her, slowly, carefully unpacking what the DNA results mean, explaining that having a birth mother doesn't erase the life she's lived, that nothing has to be decided immediately, that she is allowed to feel confused and scared and angry, and none of those feelings are wrong. Lucy asks a lot of questions during those 2 days. Practical ones, mostly. The kind a 12-year-old asks when the emotional weight of something is too large to look at directly. Will she have to change schools? Will she have to leave Syracuse? Will she ever be allowed to see the Walkers again? The therapist answers each one the same way. Not yet. We'll take it slowly. You have time. On May 7th, 2007, Clare Monroe walks into a conference room at the Syracuse Family Services building. She sits down at a table and waits. The room is plain. Fluorescent lights. A window facing a parking lot. There are 2 therapists already seated and a box of tissues on the table that Karen does not look at because if she looks at it she'll start crying before Lucy even walks in and she needs to hold it together. 5 minutes pass. The door opens. Lucy Walker comes in slowly, a therapist at her side, and stops just inside the doorway. She is small. Blonde hair pulled back. Blue eyes, the exact shade Karen has described to every detective, every journalist, every volunteer search team for 9 years. She is wearing a grey hoodie and jeans, and she is looking at Karen with an expression that is equal parts curiosity and barely contained terror. Karen stands up. She looks at her daughter for the first time in 9 years. Her daughter is 12 years old and has no idea who she is. Karen sits back down, keeps her voice soft, says hi. Lucy doesn't speak, just looks at her. Taking her in the way you look at something that doesn't fit any category you already have. The therapist guides Lucy to a chair across the table, explains gently, again, who Karen is, what the DNA test confirmed, what it means. Lucy asks the question she's been building toward for 2 days. She asks Karen if she remembers her. And Karen, who has been holding herself together with everything she has, says yes. Says she remembers the day Lucy was born. Remembers the name she chose and why she chose it. Remembers the tea parties on the blanket and the dolls arranged in a circle and a little girl who talked to someone in the garden named Leia like she was the most real thing in the world. Lucy is very still. Then she asks the harder question, the one that has no clean answer. She asks why someone would do this, why someone would take her, why the Walkers would lie to her for 9 years. Karen says she doesn't know why people do terrible things. Says she only knows that none of it, not one single part of it, is something Lucy has to carry. It was done to her. It was done to both of them. And the only thing that matters now is what comes next. They sit together for an hour, talking, crying, sitting in silence when the words run out, starting the slow, painful, necessary work of 2 people finding each other across a gap that should never have existed. Before Lucy leaves, she asks one more question. She asks if she has to choose between Karen and the Walkers, between Claire and Lucy, between the life she had and the one that was taken from her. Karen looks at her daughter and says no. Says she doesn't have to choose anything right now. Says she has waited 9 years and she can wait as long as Lucy needs. Lucy nods. Leaves with the therapist. Karen sits alone in the conference room for a long time after the door closes. Then she puts her face in her hands and lets herself fall apart, finally, completely, for the first time in 9 years, because her daughter is alive and she just sat across a table from her, and it was the hardest and the most extraordinary thing Clare Monroe has ever done. The legal machinery moves quickly once the DNA results are confirmed. Robert and Susan Walker are formally charged with participation in an illegal adoption. Their attorneys argue immediately that the couple had been deceived, that they had paid in good faith for what they were told was a legitimate private adoption, that the documents they received appeared genuine, that they had no reason to suspect otherwise. Harrison has heard this argument before. It is not entirely untrue, and it is not entirely honest, and the court will have to decide what to do with that particular shade of grey. What is not grey is this. Somewhere in the process of paying $35,000 for a child and accepting paperwork that named a doctor who had retired 6 years earlier, the Walkers made a choice not to look too closely. Whether that was fear or denial or something more deliberate, a 3-year-old girl paid the price for it. The court finds them guilty of negligence. Not conspiracy. Probation. No prison time. Barred from contact with Lucy, pending her own decision about whether she wants them in her life. Lucy, for her part, is furious. Not at Karen, at the Walkers, but also, quietly, at the situation itself. At the fact that she has to grieve two things simultaneously: the loss of the life she thought she had, and the loss of the years she should have had with Karen. At 12 years old, she is being asked to process something that would break most adults. And she does it the only way a person can, imperfectly, painfully, one day at a time. She has good days and bad days. Days where she sits with Karen at a kitchen table and laughs at something small and forgets for a moment how strange all of this is. Days where she goes back to her room and cries because she misses Susan's cooking or the sound of Robert watching television in the next room, and then feels guilty for missing them, and then feels angry for feeling guilty. The therapist tells her all of that is normal. That grief doesn't sort itself into neat categories. That she is allowed to love people who hurt her and be angry at people she loves and hold contradictions inside herself without having to resolve them on anyone else's schedule. Karen moves to Syracuse 3 weeks after their first meeting. She finds an apartment 12 minutes from Lucy's school. Gets a job at a diner. Same work she's always done. New city. Makes herself available without crowding. Texts before she calls. Waits to be invited rather than showing up. Understands instinctively that the worst thing she could do right now is make Lucy feel like she's being claimed. They start with Tuesday dinners. Just that. 1 meal a week. Karen cooks, nothing elaborate, just food. And Lucy sits at the kitchen counter and talks about school, about her friends, about things that have nothing to do with any of this. And Karen listens the way someone listens when they know that ordinary conversation is itself the miracle. The Tuesdays become the thing they both look forward to. Slowly, across months, the distance closes. Not all at once. Not in any dramatic moment. Just incrementally, the way trust always rebuilds, through repetition, through showing up, through Karen being exactly who she said she was every single time. 6 months in, Lucy starts calling her mom. Not in a formal way. Not as a declaration. Just, it slips out one Tuesday evening when Karen is at the stove and Lucy is trying to get her attention, and she says mom without thinking and then goes very quiet for a second, waiting to see how it lands. Karen keeps stirring whatever's in the pot. Doesn't make a production of it. Just says yeah, like it's the most natural thing in the world. Because it is. A year after they found each other, Lucy makes a decision. She tells the therapist first, then Karen, then the court-appointed caseworker. She wants to change her name back. Not because Lucy was a bad name or because she wants to erase the years she spent being her, but because Claire feels true in a way that Lucy never quite did. Like a coat that almost fit but not quite. Like a word she'd been pronouncing wrong her whole life and only just heard spoken correctly. Clare Monroe. She writes it out on a piece of paper and looks at it for a long time. Then she folds it up and puts it in her pocket and carries it with her for a week before she tells anyone, just getting used to the weight of it. The realness of it. Clare Monroe is alive. Clare Monroe came home. And somewhere on a street in Milbrook, a woman who spent 9 years at a window had finally done something with the guilt she'd been carrying. The investigators don't stop at Clare. Once Harrison's findings are folded into the federal case, the full scale of what the ring had been doing becomes visible in a way that is almost impossible to absorb. 15 years. Multiple states. Over 60 children identified in the records. And those are just the ones they can confirm. The actual number is likely higher. Children taken from front yards, from parks, from driveways. Taken in broad daylight by men who looked official enough that no one questioned them. Taken and sold and given new names and new families and new histories that buried the old ones so deep that most of those children will never know what was underneath. 12 people are arrested. The ringleaders, 2 men who had been operating the network since the early 90s, receive federal sentences of over 20 years each. The others receive varying terms depending on their level of involvement. The men who physically took Claire, the 2 who pulled up in front of the Monroe house on April 15th, 1998. Both are identified through the records. Both are convicted. Both go to prison. The man in the vest. The one who knelt down beside Claire's blanket and told her mommy sent him. The one who looked up at Diane Foster's window and raised his finger to his lips. He is sentenced to 23 years. Harrison closes the file on Clare Monroe on a Friday afternoon. Signs the paperwork, marks the case resolved, slides it into the archive. Then he sits at his desk for a while doing nothing in particular. Thinking about 1998. About a 3-year-old girl and a blanket and dolls arranged in a circle. About a mother who walked into his office 9 years later holding an anonymous note and something alive in her eyes that had refused to go out. He thinks about the witness. He never found out who she was. The note gave him everything he needed and nothing about herself. He ran handwriting analysis, cross-referenced the described vantage point against the houses on Maple Street, narrowed it down to a handful of properties. But he never pushed it. The case was solved. Claire was home. And whoever had finally found the courage to speak had already paid a price Harrison didn't fully understand but respected deeply. He leaves it alone. What he doesn't know, what he will never know, is that the witness has been watching all of it from 30 feet away. Diane Foster follows the case through the television. Through the news coverage of the arrests, the trial, the sentencing. She watches Harrison give a press statement outside the courthouse and thinks about the afternoon he knocked on her door and she lied to his face. She watches Clare Monroe give a brief statement to reporters outside the Family Services building in Syracuse, Claire standing beside her, taller now, steadier, one hand in her mother's, and Diane has to put her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She did that. Not alone. Not first. But she did that. The guilt doesn't disappear. She doesn't expect it to. 9 years of silence doesn't get absolved by one anonymous note and one early morning trip across the street. The debt doesn't work that way. She knows that. She will always know the version of this story where she picks up the phone in 1998 and Claire comes home before she ever forgets what home feels like. That version exists alongside this one and always will. But this version exists too. And Claire is in it. Diane watches the coverage until it fades, the way news always fades, replaced by other stories, other tragedies, other missing children and other searches that may or may not end the way this one did. She watches the street outside return to its ordinary rhythms. Watches the Monroe house sit quiet and empty now that Karen has moved to Syracuse. Watches the neighborhood continue being a neighborhood, indifferent to what happened inside it. And for the first time in a very long time, Diane Foster opens her front door. Not far. Just enough to stand in the doorway. Enough to feel the outside air on her face and not immediately retreat. She stands there for maybe 2 minutes. Looks at the empty house across the street. Looks at the spot on the lawn where Claire's blanket used to be. Then she steps back inside and closes the door. But she leaves the chain lock off. It's a small thing. It's everything. Recovery, from fear, from guilt, from the particular damage of choosing silence when the truth was needed, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive all at once in some transformative moment. It happens in inches. In small decisions made quietly when no one is watching. In chain locks left unlatched and doors opened 2 minutes longer than they were opened yesterday. Diane Foster starts leaving her house once a week. Then twice. Then more. She never stops sitting by her window. It's where she feels most herself. But the window starts to feel less like a prison and more like a choice. And that distinction, small as it sounds, changes everything about how she moves through her days. She never contacts Clare Monroe. Never introduces herself. Never explains who she was or what she saw or how long she stayed silent. Some truths are complete without being spoken aloud to the person they most concern. Diane carries hers. Quietly, privately, in the particular way of someone who has made peace with something they cannot undo but have finally, stopped running from. 2 years after Clare Monroe comes home, she stands at a podium. The room is full, families of missing children, investigators, advocates, journalists. People who have lived inside these stories the way Karen and Claire have. People who know what it costs to search for someone for years without knowing if there's anything left to find. People who know what it costs to be found. Claire is 14 years old. She is wearing a blue dress and her hair is down and she looks out at the room for a moment before she speaks. Not nervous exactly, but taking the measure of it. Deciding how much of herself to give. Then she leans into the microphone. She says her name is Clare Monroe. Says she was taken from her front yard at age 3 and spent 9 years living as someone else in a city 300 miles from her mother, with no memory of who she really was, no idea that anything had been stolen from her. Says she is standing here now because her mother refused to stop looking. Because a detective refused to let a cold case stay cold. Because a witness who had been silent for 9 years finally found the courage to speak. She pauses. Says she is not going to tell this audience that everything is fine now. That coming home fixed everything. That the years she lost feel like they were simply returned to her. Because that's not how it works. There are things she will never get back. The years themselves, for one. The version of herself that would have grown up in Milbrook with Karen. The memories that didn't survive being told they were dreams. She will never know what she would have been like if none of this had happened. That person doesn't exist anymore. Maybe never fully existed. And grieving something you can't quite picture is its own particular kind of hard. But she is here. And her mother is in this room. And somewhere in Syracuse there is a Tuesday evening ritual involving a kitchen and ordinary food and conversation that has nothing to do with any of this. And that ordinariness, that specific, unremarkable, Tuesday evening ordinariness, is the most valuable thing Clare Monroe owns. She looks out at the audience. Says she knows there are other children out there right now, living under names that aren't theirs. Sitting in classrooms with no idea that somewhere a mother is still putting up flyers, still walking the same route home, still keeping a light on. Children who remember fragments they've been told are just dreams, a different yard, a different voice, a name that floats at the edges of sleep and disappears by morning. She says she knows there are witnesses too. People sitting on something they saw. Something they told themselves didn't matter, or was too dangerous, or happened too long ago to change anything. People living inside the particular silence of knowing and not speaking, and paying for it every single day in ways they've stopped expecting anyone to understand. She says to those people, directly, without softening it, that it is not too late. It was not too late when someone slipped a note under Clare Monroe's door 9 years after the fact. It was not too late when a detective pulled a cold case file out of a cabinet because an anonymous letter gave him somewhere to look. It is not too late today. It will not be too late tomorrow. Because Clare Monroe was gone for 9 years. And she came home. Karen sits in the third row and watches her daughter speak. Watches her stand straight at that podium and hold the room with a quiet authority that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what she survived. Watches her transform the worst thing that ever happened to either of them into something that might prevent it from happening to someone else. Karen thinks about the woman on Main Street. The flat voice, the phone to her ear, the single word that stopped her on the sidewalk. She has thought about that woman almost every day since. Wondered who she was. What she knew. What it cost her to say it and then disappear. She never found her. Never will. The woman kept her promise. Karen found her daughter, and she does not remember the woman. Not her face. Not her name. Just the word. Leia. And the truth it unlocked. After the conference, Claire and Karen drive back to the apartment together. It's a Tuesday. Karen cooks. Claire sits on the counter and talks about her friends at the new school, about a history project she's been putting off, about something funny that happened at lunch that has nothing to do with any of this. Karen listens. Outside, the city moves the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, full of people walking past each other on sidewalks without knowing what the person they just passed is carrying. Full of children playing in front yards. Full of witnesses standing at windows. Full of mothers walking routes they have walked 1,000 times, carrying hope that has no logical reason to survive but survives anyway. Somewhere in Milbrook, in a house with a window facing an empty street, a woman sits and watches the neighborhood and feels, for the first time in a very long time, like the view from her window is something she chose. And somewhere in a courtroom file room, in a cabinet between 2 other cases that are still open and still waiting, there's a folder marked Clare Monroe, resolved. Resolved. Not erased. Not undone. Resolved. Because a mother never gave up. Because a witness finally spoke. Because a detective pulled a cold case out of a cabinet and refused to put it back. Because Clare Monroe came home. And her story, every unbearable, extraordinary inch of it, belongs to every family that is still searching. Every witness that is still deciding. Every investigator staring at a file that has no leads and no momentum and no obvious reason for hope. Don't give up. Don't stay silent. Don't stop looking. Because 9 years passed. And Clare Monroe came home.